We're going to be talking about the useMemo hook. So the useMemo hook, you can think of it as the memoization or caching of a value so it doesn't have to be recalculated again. So let's give a quick example here. I have an empty component and let's just call this useMemo. So we have a label right here, and you'll be able to see it on the right hand side, right? useMemo, and the first thing is when I say that we don't have to recompute it, basically if there's an expensive function that you're calling in this React component, for example some sort of sorting or some sort of loop, if that component re-renders, it's going to be called every time. And we can just have an example here. Let's call it expensive calculation, and let's have it take in some text so that we can console log it. Text is running, right? So let's see if you can see that if I use this expensive calculation function in my component, so let's just say the result is the return of, and we're going to call this the non-memoized version, okay? So every time you're going to see that this non-memoized is running, right? If I refresh on the right hand side, you can see non-memoized is running. Now what happens if we change the state of this component? You're going to see that this expensive calculation, even though there's no return value, so it's essentially returning the same value, it's going to be called every time. So let's add a use state here, and let's just call it a value and set value. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be incrementing this value each time in order to trigger a re-render. Let's change that, and I'll need to add a button here. So on click, what's going to happen when we click it, we are just going to increment the current value by 1. Alright, and let's close that off, and let's even just display that value here. So now what we're doing here is that we're giving a way to re-render this component. And let me just clear the console. So clearing it, and every time I click this button, you can see non-memoized is running. This expensive calculation on line 7 is being called, it's being reconstructed and being called every time. Let's do it again. Now you can see 2, 2, 3. Alright, so what happens if we want to save that value because it's not changing? We don't have to do this expensive calculation every time. Well, in that case, what we want to do is wrap it in a useMemo, just as I'm doing right here. And useMemo takes 2 arguments, okay? It takes the function that you're using first, and then it has a dependency array. So basically what that means is for whatever value I put in the dependency array, if that value changes, then it says, okay, let's recompute using this expensive calculation function. So let me go ahead on the right hand side and clear the console again, and let's see what happens now that I've added this useMemo. Let me just change that. Alright, so useMemo is running. Now that's because I've just saved it, but let's see, let's increment that state. You see how I'm changing the value here? It's re-rendering every time, but this useMemo is not being called. And another way we can just test it is, let me just add a console log inside this component. Rendering. You can see rendering and non-memoized is running. That's the first call. Now I'm going to hit the button again. Rendering is called, but we don't see a non-memoized is running. Right? Again, and in fact now it should actually just be called memoized. Alright? Rendering is going, but memoized is not going. So that's what the dependency array does. Because it's not depending on, let's say, the value here, we're not recomputing this function. What happens if I decide to put value in here? Now every time the value changes, this expensive function is going to be called. So it's almost like as how we just started. See, look, if I click it, Memoized is running. Memoized is running. Memoized is running. Because we're depending on a state that's being changed every time. Let me give you another example of how this can be used. So say, for example, I'm going to have another state here, and I'm just going to call it toggle. Let's call it set toggle, and we're going to initialize it as false. And I just want to have a button that toggles between true or false to trigger a re-render. So on a button, and what happens when we click it, once it's being clicked, we want to just set the state of the toggle value. So let's say set toggle, and we're going to invert the current value right here. And let's actually just have the button say toggle. Well, actually what we can do is say display true. We're going to use a ternary operator here. So if toggle is true, simply display true. Otherwise, display false. And let's close up this button. There we go. Right? So they're right next to each other. So every time I click this button, it's going to trigger a re-render. Rendering is called, but you'll notice that the expensive calculation is not being called. And why is that? It's because this value is not changing. The value which our useMemo depends on is not changing, even though the toggle value in line 13 is changing. So if I click it, we're not recomputing that we're not using that expensive function. But look, once I hit the increment button, right, Memoize is running, Memoize is running, Memoize is running, because that value is changing. So that's what useMemo does. It saves the value. Don't get it confused with useCallback. I'll make a video and link it in the description later. But useMemo, just know that it's regarding a value that needs to be saved. Thanks.